from memory, 25 Squadron, of which I was flight commander at the time, were going to be the first squadron to deploy out to the Gulf. So we started looking at the training of crews and getting people up to speed, because what we were going to be doing was to operate in that environment. It was deemed that we needed some extra protection on the aeroplanes. Got to bear in mind at the time, the Tornado F3 was still armed with Skyflash, Sidewinder and the gun. And we had chaff and flares attached to the aeroplane, and they'd become a proper official modification from what had been bolted on the aeroplane in Gulf War I and subsequent times. But there were more complex threats deemed to be out there in Iraq at the time. And the towed radar decoy had been under development for an awfully long time. And towed radar decoy was put as a priority to go on the aeroplane for operating Op Southern Watch. So we had to do the training for that, and of course aeroplanes had to be modified. The towed radar decoy was needed to be mounted on outboard pylons, and of course any F3 aficionado would say, well, the F3 didn't have outboard pylons. Well, actually it did, because they were retrofitted. They were still there, the wiring was there, because obviously the wings are the same wings as go on the GR1, GR4, and of course, you know, that wiring still all existed. So it was only a case of fitting pylons, and you know, the wiring was in there, and they just needed all the correct data buses that could take the information and pass the information to the towed radar decoy. And essentially, the towed radar decoy, we carried a single one, which went on the left outboard pylon, and it was a modified FIMAT pod. So something that the GR1 had been carrying for many, many years. It was a modified FIMAT pod with the front half being all the electronics pack, all the clever bits, and then the towed radar decoy, which is a relatively small thing. You know, with I can't remember the length of the wire that it was attached to, but this thing used to be carried captive, and if you needed to use it for defence, then it was a button push, from what I recall, by the navigator, and this thing would be released and out it would go, and it would provide a transmitting decoy to try and decoy a missile that had been fired at you.
Was that essentially, sorry, was that essentially what the EF3 was going to become? Something similar? Or?
No, the EF3, and I had very little involvement in the EF3, but I do remember the trials happening. The idea was that was going to be a suppression of enemy air defences aeroplane. So it was
like a weasel.
It was so effectively a wild weasel role, and it was being looked at to carry the alarm missile. So it was actually, you know, the towed radar decoy is a defence piece of defensive kit, whereas the alarm, of course, is going to be an active, you know, taking out enemy radars, and that was the whole idea of that. Yeah. It's a real shame that project didn't actually come any more to fruition, because I think it would have been a really, really efficient aeroplane, and of course, you know, quite a new role for us air defenders at the time.
But yeah, sorry to interrupt there. So
that's okay. Of course, the towed radar decoy was only carried, we were only allowed to carry one, because actually at the beginning of the whole thing there weren't that many around, so much so that actually although we could carry them for training, we couldn't deploy them, because once you deployed them you have to jettison them, and of course you lose the decoy. And there really weren't that many available for operational service, so we had to preserve the ones that were actually in the Gulf. And if you did deploy it, yes, you could cut it away, in which case you lost it, but we always brought it back. So we brought it back to the airfield and we dropped it over the airfield, so at least they could recover it, but then they had to refurbish the thing and then repack the whole thing. So it was a one-shot affair. So once it was deployed, it was hanging out there in the wind.
Right.
So and from memory, I mean, it worked really, really well, and I remember very, very few that actually dropped off. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, you know, that you were probably deploying this thing while pulling quite a lot of G at quite a high speed. It was under a lot of stress, so it was actually a very well designed bit of kit.